Hi, and welcome to our 8th asynchronous module. Today I'm going to talk about a project I did here at the University of Hawaii. I started it about 2 years ago, and it culminated in a presentation at the recent TESOL conference in Chicago. The project was titled English Language Learner Dialogue Journals, A Bridge to More Complex Academic Writing. And I'm going to take you quickly through some background information related to the study, and also through the methods and then the results. Now, to start with the background information, journal writing, as I'm sure you're aware, can take place in many different forms in schools. So not just in language classes, but even in history, in biology, and many other different subjects. Now, within the realm of journal writing activities, I see a continuum that starts with a type of journal that is really only meant for you to see, for the writer to read. And that would be sort of similar to keeping a diary. This journal ideally would not be seen by anyone else, and it's really a personal type of writing activity. On the complete other side of the continuum, you would have a dialogue journal. And this type of journal is meant to be really or serve as a record of a written conversation between you and another individual. Often in language classes, that other individual is a teacher, but the teacher does not have to be the only other person. Now, there are many other ways that teachers incorporate journals into their classroom. One frequent method that I have seen is where students will respond to particular prompts in their journal, and every few days or maybe once a week, the teacher will review what the students have written and maybe write in a sentence or a quick note in the margin. But there isn't exactly a complete or a full entry. Now, dialogue journals, as I see them, require equal participation on the part of the student and the teacher. And I'm going to show you an example of what that would look like. So, if you see those two examples on the page, you'll see in the top picture an example of my first entry to a student. And then in the bottom picture, you'll see the second part of my entry and also the student's entry. So what you might notice is that our entries, hers is a little shorter than mine at the beginning, although they do get longer. But generally, our entries are of similar length, and we both ask and answer questions of each other. The definition that I've used comes from Peyton 2000, and she says that dialogue journals are written conversations in which a learner and a teacher or other writing partner communicate regularly, daily, weekly, or on a schedule that fits the educational setting over a semester, school year, or course. And what I did is I kept dialogue journals with my students in HELP, done at the Hawaii English Language Program, over the course of a term. And at HELP, the terms are 8 weeks long, so they actually have 2 terms every semester. And there were 12 students enrolled in my class when I started this. Now, there are many benefits of dialogue journals. The first benefit that has been discussed in the literature is that dialogue journals supply a unique reading and writing experience for both people involved. Now, obviously, we can read books, and when you did your reading lesson plans, many of you then, as post-reading activities, incorporated some sort of writing task. But the text that everyone read was the same. The same is true with extensive reading. Some classrooms may have a bunch of books on the shelves, and the neat part in terms of collaboration is that if you and a partner choose to read the same book, you can then talk about the contents. However, with dialogue journals, both the content of both individuals' entries are different from other people's, and sometimes it can be really motivating to read. So I've used dialogue journals with kindergarteners and also with high beginning language learners all the way up to advanced learners. And so even for younger learners or learners whose reading abilities maybe aren't as high as you think they would need to be for them to participate, they're still definitely able to participate, and they'll eagerly look up vocabulary words, etc., because they are really invested in trying to understand what you've written. Another benefit of dialogue journals is that students get a chance to engage in writing that will not be corrected nor evaluated. Of course, much of the writing you have done for this course has received feedback and evaluations in the form of grades. The feedback, of course, might be comments of things you did well. There's also been error correction. But dialogue journals, as seen by most researchers, are a place to engage students in writing that is not corrected. I've seen 2 studies that have looked specifically at the possibility of correcting the students' writing within the journal. And although the studies reported that the students' writing did become more accurate, what I found in the writing course that I was teaching was that this was sort of a space for both the teacher and the students to not have to worry about being so grammatically correct. And it was allowed to kind of increase their fluency in writing, which leads to the third benefit, and that is when students are writing on a regular basis. So whether you incorporate dialogue journals into every class period or once a week, the habit of writing helps them to become more fluent writers. Also, benefits have been discussed in terms of building a stronger connection between teachers and students. So I've had students ask me an entire range and variety of questions, and depending on what they're writing about, I may ask them additional questions. And I've not only experienced but read other research articles documenting how it really created a greater understanding between teachers and students. You get to know more about who they are as individuals, not just as learners in your classroom. And finally, for teachers, dialogue journals provide them with the opportunity to reflect on their beliefs about language learning and teaching. Specifically, when using dialogue journals in a language class, students may use the dialogue journal as a space for asking you questions about how they can become better writers, how they can get more comfortable or become more fluent in writing. And in responding to their questions, it forces the teacher in a way to articulate their beliefs about how those particular aspects, those particular language skills can be improved, or how they feel that they can best be improved. Now, in spite of the benefits that have been documented in past literature, there are still a few questions that remain, and I wanted to investigate or to try and find an answer to these questions. So first, given the extraordinary time commitment required by a teacher and the students, teachers likely want to know that their efforts in responding to dialogue journals will make a lasting difference in the writing abilities of their students. Now, when I use these dialogue journals in my classroom, students spend anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes working on their entry. I then, with the 12 students, would take their journals, and after school, it would take me about 10 to 15 minutes to respond to each of their entries. So if you take 12 and you multiply it by 10 minutes, you end up with about 2 hours. So that would be about 2 hours of actual writing for 10 to 15 minutes of class time in where the students are actually writing. So for teachers, I was curious to know if this investment was really worth it, and if as a result of participating in these dialogue journals, students' writing did become more complex. And with the exception of one study back in 1994 by Christine Casanave, no other study has really tried to analyze the linguistic data that is afforded or that you can get from these dialogue journals. Now, I situated this study within dynamic systems theory perspective to language development. If you aren't familiar with this theory, it's okay, there is no test on it. But essentially, proponents of this theory believe that language growth and language development, if it's continually being pursued, is going to increase over time. However, it is not exactly a linear increase, and that there will be periods of really high growth. So for example, if you think about time spent abroad, or those days when you're really studying for a test and you're listening to tapes or however and spending a lot of time in the language, and then you feel like, wow, I definitely can do more now than I could yesterday or than I could before I studied abroad. So those times of significant growth will also be accompanied by times in which your abilities maybe go down a little bit or some stagnant periods. But ideally, over time, your abilities will get better in the language. It's just that it's not quite so linear or stepwise as we maybe would want or hope it is. So there are two things I looked at: syntactic complexity and lexical complexity. So these are both aspects of linguistic complexity, and I wanted to see how my students' writing was going to improve on these measures. So if you take a look on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see syntactic complexity. I give you an example. So a very simple sentence would be, the cat gets tuna. Okay, so you have a subject, the cat, your verb gets, and you have your object, tuna. Now, a more syntactically complex sentence is right below it. The stray cat who lives on our block gets tuna when he comes to our house. So what you have is an adjective modifying the noun as well as an adjective phrase, the who lives on our block, and you have an adverbial phrase at the end, when he comes to our house. So I was curious to see, and I hypothesized that my students' sentences would become more syntactically complex over the course of the time that we spent together in this writing class. I also envisioned that their writing would become more lexically complex. So if we take a very similar sentence to the previous example, you'll see I have the cat gets tuna from them. There we have very frequent lexical items that would be known to most beginning level language learners. Essentially saying the same thing as that sentence, but with less frequent words, is the tabby extorts marine delicacies from passerby. So we have the same structure, but we are using words that are not as frequently used in our English, in our spoken language, and in our written language. And that was my hypothesis. So the research question specifically is, how do the syntactic and lexical complexity of English language learners' written production within a dialogue journal change over the course of 8 weeks? Now, 8 weeks is a very short amount of time. And generally, for example, if you've heard the name Lourdes Ortega, who used to be a professor here at the University of Hawaii and now works at Georgetown, she hypothesized and she did a meta-analysis of studies looking at syntactic complexity and hypothesized that learners likely need about 3 to 4 months, or at least researchers should allow students or participants in their research about 3 to 4 months to really see improvements in syntactic and lexical complexity in their writing. So it does take a long time to see development in your student writing. but I wanted to see if 8 weeks would make a difference. I mentioned that I had 12 students. I was only able to use 10 of their dialogue journals because one student was absent often, and so did not have as many entries as the other students. And one student was rather erratic in his entries. Sometimes he would take his journal home and compose 3 or 4 pages, and other times he just would write 1 sentence. So I used 10. And in total, I created a learner corpus that consists of 100 journal entries. So I had 10 journal entries per participant. And essentially, over an 8-week term, they wrote an entry approximately once or twice a week in response to an entry that I wrote. And I chose some different syntactic and lexical complexity measures that are available through an online tool that Professor Kyle in our very own SLS department created. Basically, I wouldn't worry about all the numbers and the measures on the left, but you'll notice that only one of the measures of syntactic complexity, which is the number of clauses per sentence, saw a significant increase in their writing. Okay? Nothing else was significant, but at least this one measure was. So in other words, over the course of those 8 weeks, my students' writing did become more syntactically complex in terms of the number of clauses that they used per sentence. In terms of lexical complexity, it's very interesting. You'll see that what these measures show is that my students, rather than use words that are less frequent in English language, they started using words that are more frequent in the English language, which is the opposite of what I hypothesized. And I'm going to show you what it would look like on a graph. So this first graph is sort of depicting, you have each of the students there, and it shows you the measure of the number of clauses per sentence, and how it's gradually increased over time. I mean, not gradually, but you'll see that there are sharp peaks, followed by troughs, and followed by some periods when there wasn't much of an increase. But overall, this difference was significant. Now, you'll notice that the graph on the right, that academic lemma range, basically, what the graph is showing is that over time, as I mentioned, my students started to use words that are more frequently found in reference corpora, over time, which is not what we would have expected. And the jury's still out on why that may have happened. So if you guys have any suggestions, I'd love to hear it. But it wasn't exactly what we expected. So, the conclusions I came to were that although the participants used significantly more frequent words by the end of the 8-week writing course, the number of clauses per sentence and the lexical sophistication of their writing, which I measured by meaningfulness of content words, and I can explain that to you more fully if you're interested, that increased significantly as well. So my goal, in spite of the small sample size, was to contribute to 2 different subfields within second language studies or underneath the umbrella of applied linguistics. And I think that the findings could contribute to the area of second language writing in the sense that these results might inspire future longitudinal studies on the language learning potential of writing, specifically within dialogue journals. And I also hope that the findings might contribute to research being done in the area of learner corpora. So I tried to address a concern that was expressed by Cobb and Horst in their 2015 article concerning what appears to be reduced interest in learners per se. Rather, the learner corpus has become primarily a test bed for the development and testing of measures. So I wanted to make sure to place the learners, my students, front and center, while still creating a learner corpus and using that corpus to analyze their writing. So I just acknowledge some of the professors in our department, and there's some references if you find dialogue journals particularly interesting and want to read more about them. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and finish our lecture for today. I hope you had a chance to read the article that I submitted to Hawaii TESOL. You are also welcome to submit articles to that newsletter, especially if you're really proud of a particular paper you did for one of your classes, or even if you have a really interesting dialogue journal that you want to, or an interesting reflective journal from our class that you'd like to develop a little bit and submit for publication, just let me know, because it's a really nice venue to have your first publication and communicate with other practicing teachers in the field. So thank you very much for listening. I look forward to getting short emails from you about what you learned and your plans for the writing lesson plan. And I will see you all on Wednesday morning in our next synchronous session. All right, have a good one. Bye.